Okay, good evening. Sorry I had to put it off till tonight, and I'll send out a message end of this week that next week we're also on Wednesday. Wednesday I already know because Tuesday night I have a wedding, Bezrat Hashem, next week. So we'll meet on Wednesday next week, Bezrat Hashem. Okay, so we're going to do a couple things tonight. First, we're going to finish, hopefully, kind of a review of the things we've been doing over the last 2, 3 months on the history of Zionism and kind of bring it all together. We already talked about last week. You already did part of it. This week we're going to continue and finish it. And then the next step will be to talk about conservative Judaism, the movement, its birth, why it happened, why it came about, etc. Because it happens around the same time period. So we were up to the topic of the Chovevei Tzion movement, which is Zionism before Herzl. It's not a political movement in the modern sense. It was more of emotional, a feeling we need to get out of there. We need to get out of Eastern Europe or Europe. It was decentralized. It was deeply Jewish as well. The people who were involved in the Chovevei Tzion movement, and you'll find, by the way, there are many shuls around the world that have taken that name, rabbis. They were maskilim, meaning people who were the Enlightenment that hit the Jews that were not the most religious. There were merchants, there were idealists, there were survivors of pogroms, meaning the Chovevei Tzion movement of there was a need to have our own country, which we're going to get a little more detail in a moment, was made up of people, like all different spheres of people. But they were all held together with one conviction. That was that Jewish life in exile in Chutz La'aretz was no longer viable. What do they focus on? Again, I know that a lot of this, we talk about it in bits and pieces over time at different people, but right now kind of putting it all together. So they focused on Aliyah and settlement, and not so much on diplomacy. There were other movements that did that. They had a very strong base, especially in Eastern Europe. And one of the things that moved this movement, that's a poor use of words, that propelled this movement were the pogroms in Eastern Europe in 1881 to 1882. Chovevei Tzion represented Zionism as a response, not an ideology. So that's a very important distinction. Many other movements, especially among the religious Zionists, were we have to have our own home, we have to keep mitzvot in Israel. Others were we have to have our own home, whether it was labor or it was secular Zionism, because like any other people in the world, we deserve our own country. Chovevei Tzion was, at this point, at least early on, was driven more by a response and not necessarily, like I said, like an ideology. But at the same time, they understood that no Enlightenment theory that what was going through Europe at the time was going to protect them. No matter how good things that would say to be for the Jews, we know it doesn't end well for the Jews. Which brings us to Pinsker, Leon Pinsker, who lived in early to late 1800s, and he dealt with more of political Zionism. He is probably one of the first great Zionists who was, let's say in medicine, a diagnostician. What does a diagnostician do? So, diagnostician, from the word diagnosis, is a person who can, in a medical term, can look at a patient and will see a series of symptoms. And based on those symptoms, can say, okay, they have this disease, this illness, and here's how we're going to have to hopefully be able to treat it. And he, in his book, Auto-Emancipation, which he wrote in 1882, later in his life, he said that anti-Semitism is a psychological disease. And I said myself personally that Jew hatred / anti-Semitism belongs to the DSM manual. It's the mental health manual diagnoses, or health manual, not mental health only, diagnoses in the medical world. Jews were perceived as a ghost nation. What did that mean? That meant that even though they may live within another country, whether it's France or Ukraine or wherever it might be, at that time it was the Ukraine, they were still seen as the outsiders. There were people within a people, a goy in betoch goy. And emancipation failed because the Jews themselves were not granted any form of sovereignty. And Pinsker himself was not a religious man, but his analysis of what was going on in Chutz La'aretz, and especially in Eastern Europe, was brutally honest. And that's something that I think that we today can learn a very strong lesson from. It's been said, I know I've quoted him before, but I can't remember his name offhand. Said that those who fail to remember history are doomed to repeat it. And we do today in 2026, Tafshin Pevav, have the hindsight and knowledge. It's not that long ago. It's not in the Middle Ages. It's just 100 plus years ago where we saw what was going on in Eastern Europe before World War One. We saw what was going on in Europe and other parts of the world before World War II. And sadly, there were not enough people who stood up and said, this isn't good. This isn't good for the Jews. There's no future. There's no anything. We need to take action. There aren't enough people saying that today either, which is a very sad case. But Pinsker did. He stood up. And he said, to the extent, basically his thesis was that Jews will never be normal until they are a nation among nations, meaning that we needed to have our own country. Because while we were a nation or a people inside of another nation, it was never going to work. He didn't initially insist on specifically on Eretz Yisrael, but what he was looking more for safety, for a safe haven for the Jews. What drew him back was not necessarily theology, because again, he wasn't a religious person, but the realization that the only one land that could mobilize Jewish loyalty across cultures. How come? Let's assume for a moment the Jews were given a parcel of land in Uganda. And I always come back to that because the Uganda plan and one of that Herzl proposed in one of the Zionist congresses. So let's say Uganda said, okay, you're going to be able to have X amount of square miles or kilometers, and you could set up your nation here. So maybe it'll appeal to some people because at least we have a home, we have a place to go to, we get away from the pogroms, or we get away from the Jew hatred, we get away from our windows being broken, Jews being spat upon, etc. But it's not necessarily going to talk to the neshama. It's not going to talk to them deep in the kishkas, as they say. It's Uganda. But he felt that the pull of Israel, of the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, would be universal for the Jews because they've been talking about it and davening about it and praying about it and speaking about it for thousands of years already. Whether it's under a chuppah, whether it's a prayer, again, even though he wasn't a religious man, he understood the reality, said that that's why it needed to be in the land of Israel. He bridged the gap between the trauma of the pogroms and the anti-Semitism and the politics. And he transforms that suffering into a strategy. Remember, we've talked about so many of these different personalities that we've been meeting over these last couple of months, maybe more, that they were more than just what made them great people. And again, doesn't mean Pinsker was a fantastic individual. Doesn't mean Mohammed was it means they were able to accomplish certain things in their own style. But what made them great? We talked about this. They had not only a vision, but they also had ideas of how to carry out that vision, how to bring it to fruition. And that's a very big difference. Like we have people who have been these great thinkers, but they can't do anything about it. And people who are able to do stuff, but they don't have the brains behind it in order how to organize it properly. And these people we've been talking about, in fact, did, including Pinsker himself. One of the first revolutionary kind of movements within the Zionist movement was BILU, which was an acronym. It stood for Bet Yaakov Lechu V'Nelcha, the house of Jacob, let us get up and go. It was radical-ish early Zionism. It was mostly made up of young people, Russians, some revolutionaries, and they're very heavily influenced by socialist ideas. Matter of fact, because that's what they were used to, they believed that the old Jewish world, as they knew it, was going to die off. That Jews would need to be reborn through labor, and that the land of Israel would create a Hebrew human being, a Jewish human being, something connecting to our past. But not for religious reasons. Matter of fact, they're often very hostile to the Jewish people, to the Jewish religion, but they were very rooted in the biblical language in Hebrew. They're rooted in symbols. And in a sense, the funny thing is they lived Tanakh more than they lived in Halacha, which meant that they felt a connection to the Torah, but not from a religious perspective, but from a peoplehood perspective, from a collective memory perspective, and with no sense of fealty whatsoever to keeping Torah mitzvot per se or halacha. Their failure, the failure of the movement in general, taught Zionism, the broader idea of Zionism, a very important lesson. Ideology without infrastructure will collapse. They had ideology, but they didn't have a framework on which to build it. They had these general ideas, but they were lacking a certain foundation, which therefore caused a problem within the movement itself. But truly, their audacity to do what they wanted to do, it reshaped the imagination. It helped spark the interest and ideas of the next generation, of one of whom, of course, we talked about at length, was Eliezer ben Yehuda, who refined the idea of what Hebrew meant in his time. It wasn't just that Hebrew was sacred to him. He considered it oxygen. What's the difference? Someone could look at Torah and say, it's holy, it's sacred, it's important to us. We have to learn Torah. But okay, if I don't learn Torah this week or this month, it's not the worst thing in the world. You know, I'll keep Torah mitzvot, but I don't have to really learn. It's not important. So that's not their oxygen. It's not what's giving them life. Like we've talked about recently a couple of times in Mishlei. And you know the words, it's a tree of life to those who hold on to it. He looked at Hebrew like this, that Hebrew was like the oxygen of the Jewish people. And of course, we know that religious Jews feared this idea of the growth of Hebrew as a spoken language because they felt it was desecrating what they called Lashon HaKodesh. It's still Lashon HaKodesh. And also secularization of the sacred words. That you take words and that are Hebrew, and instead of speaking Yiddish or some other foreign language, you take the words and use them for common things. People were the mentality was very much against that. But Ben Yehuda came back and said, look, taking Hebrew and make it a dead language, an unspoken language that's used only for prayer and for learning Torah, is the desecration of the language itself. If you're saying it's the holy language, then it needs to be part of your daily life too. Speech is life. I mean, that's how we communicate. And Tanakh itself speaks out in the streets. What does that mean? What do he mean by that? There are certain times we use expressions. Let's just take a modern example, okay? It'll be number of weeks till we get to the parasha of Behar, but one of the more famous Rashis at the beginning of Parashat Behar is Ma'inyan Shmita Eitzel Har Sinai. And without going into what it means, it's the equivalent expression that people might say, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? But people use the expression in modern Hebrew. They say, Ma'inyan Shmita Eitzel Har Sinai. That's Rashi. It's Rashi's quoting Midrash and talking about the beginning of Parashat Behar. There's just many psukim throughout Tanakh that are used, or words that bring us into our modern time with the ancient words. Without Ben Yehuda, it's possible Zionism would have remained a movement of immigrants. With him, it became a civilization. That's a really broad statement, a strong statement. What does it mean? There are people who are offended by others who make no attempt to learn Hebrew. I'm talking right now, today, modern times, who make no attempt whatsoever to learn Hebrew because they feel they can get along in Amharic, or they get along in English, or they can get along in Russian, and they can for the most part, especially English. You can get along it very well in Israel without knowing a word of Hebrew. Unfortunately, you can. But it still is the great divide. You know, when I talk to students or I talk to adults, and we talk about the language and the importance. So as soon as you shut down and say, I'm not talking about people who can't learn the language. I'm not talking about people who have the ability, who don't have the ability. I'm talking about people who just make a proactive decision to say, no, it's not for me. I don't want to even take my time to learn it. So you do is you're building not only walls, you're also shutting doors. So a person who's in their 30s looking for a job and doesn't speak Hebrew, they have cut out a huge area of possible and potential job areas in the job market. So I shouldn't say just, I'm an immigrant too. They're immigrants and they have remained and decided to stay segregated. Again, I'm not talking about, people who have hard time learning Hebrew that made the attempt. Kol hakavod. It's not easy if you don't not good with languages. But again, the people who just say, I'm not even going to bother. So they're in a sense separating themselves. So what Ben Yehuda did by making the language pervasive, it took people who were from Poland and Hungary and Russia and Yemen and all these different countries, and gave them literally a common language to help them grow into civilization. Achad Ha'am, that was his pen name of Asher Ginsburg, was Herzl's, and we're not going to go back to Herzl in this review, because I think we did a lot about him with like 3 classes. Achad Ha'am was Herzl's probably greatest intellectual opponent. He believed that a Jewish state without Jewish spirit would fail. Again, Herzl was not religious, and he didn't really care too much about the religious aspect. But Achad Ha'am did. And saying the political sovereignty, which is what Herzl wanted in the land of Israel, he said that wasn't sufficient, that wasn't enough. That Zion, as he called it in Hebrew, would need to be a spiritual and cultural center. That it couldn't just be enough to be Jewish in a Jewish land, but it had to have the Jewish neshama. He didn't say this is my word now, but in the sense the investing it with the spirituality of the Jewish people as well. To religious Jews, it's kind of an oxymoron, I guess, or not, no, a contradiction in terms. He was both a threat and an ally because he rejected halachic authority, but at the same time, he insisted on Jewish ethical continuity, which is a very big part of halacha. Is the idea of derech eretz kodma leTorah, that derech eretz comes first. He feared hollow nationalism, like having a frame but nothing, no substance to it. Ironically, religious Zionism would later actually take on a lot of what Achad Ha'am had said, but without abandoning halacha. For those of us who affiliate, whether officially or unofficially, with the religious Zionist world, we know that part of our raison d'etre in the land of Israel, anywhere, of course, is fealty to halacha and Torah and mitzvot. And I said I wasn't going to talk much about Herzl, so I'll just talk a little bit for a couple minutes. He didn't really understand Judaism that deeply, but he understood the power of Judaism. He transformed Zionism into diplomacy. He gave it global visibility. He was able to force the Jewish people to really imagine something that was beyond imaginable, and that was sovereignty, having our own country. I want you to go back in time for a minute, no matter how old you are, and to think about your great-great-grandparents or your great-great-great-grandparents who likely were somewhere living in Europe, maybe United States, likely in Europe. And they were living in a time of pogroms. They're living in a time of the shtetl, where things for the Jews were not so great whatsoever. That's a really big understatement. And you were to go back and tell them that not only, and you go back on a time machine, not only is there a land of Israel, it's a sovereign country. We have a mix of so many different types of Jews and non-Jews living in the country. The Jews run their own country, that we have a government, that we have laws, and you're not executed, God forbid, for keeping Torah mitzvot, and the doors are open. The chances of them believing you, who knows? Would they believe you? Did not believe you? I don't know. But the idea that even just going back to the 1930s and say, because as things start progressing, the vision already is getting stronger. But before the 1930s, that there's this country where will be open for the Jews. It'll be our country, not a place for the Jews, but it'll be the Jews' country. Israel, the land of the Jewish people, run by the Jewish people, mostly. Sound like an absolute pie in the sky, no chance. So what Herzl was doing, in a sense, with his form of Zionism, again, the fact that it wasn't religious, in this case, didn't make that difference in what he was able to bring across, and that was to allow them to imagine in a serious way sovereignty was possible. Why is that so critical? Because if you don't think it's possible at all, why would you work towards it? Why would you think about uprooting your family to go to this land that's filled with swamps and all kinds of disease and all kinds of problems? When are you going to go there? And for the next 10 generations, you're not going to have anything. That's what I want to go for. On the other hand, the religious Jews distrusted him. He was culturally ignorant of Jewish history, not Jewish history, of Jewish practice. He distanced himself from tradition. I can't tell you he was an atheist per se. I know his children certainly had, let's just say they went off the derech. That's a nice way to put it. But without Herzl, Zionism would maybe have remained marginal. We need all these other movements, whether it's Bilu and Chovevei Tzion and all these different movements. He is the one that really lit the fire under the eventually this mass of this critical mass of people wanting a country for different reasons that allowed the doors to get opened and to really bring it about. The Ottoman doors, the British doors would never have opened. Shouldn't say never. It's in Hashem's hands, but there would be a very different part of history. We might be living only now in the time when the doors are opening, but he was the one responsible for the doors for the Ottomans and eventually the British to have opened because of his genius. He turned desire into institutions. And again, you see that, putting aside Israel for a minute, you see that around the world. We're just talking the Jewish world. You talk about institutions when there's a need, whether it's in the United States or in Israel. Lupoliansky, Zichrono Livracha, who passed away recently, who was the former mayor of Yerushalayim, who was responsible for the founding of Yad Sarah. There was a tremendous need in this country, and the amount that they do in this country is unbelievable. With the giving, the loaning, the selling of all the things for people who are in need for medical assistance and machinery and equipment, everything. And it wasn't just he sat one day and said, "Wow, it'd be really a good idea that we should have that. Okay, let's see what's for lunch." He did it, took action. And this is also what these other people have been learning about. Then we come to Rav Yaakov Reines and the birth of Mizrahi. He understood the danger like everybody else in people have been talking about, but in a different way. Not just the physical danger the Jews were in, but the spiritual danger. He understood that if Zionism remained secular, then Torah Jews would become irrelevant to Jewish history. It would just be a footnote in history. So his solution was Mizrahi, which we said stood for Merkaz Ruchani, or a center, a spiritual center, became Mizrahi. I've said this before, myself included, until many years ago. Most people who are members of Mizrahi or affiliate with Mizrahi have no idea what the word means. They think it has to do with Mizrahi music, maybe, or which doesn't make sense because it's not. We're not talking about the Sephardi Jews. Generally, we're talking about the Mizrahi world, at least in the past. So Reines argued that Zionism is a political tool. It's not a theology. That Torah has to be guiding us in seeking sovereignty and in entrenching it into this country. And if we are absenting ourselves from the religious aspect in settling the country, then all we have done is to surrender. We've surrendered to history, said, okay, this is all we're going to be. That's all we're going to aspire to. And he reframed Zionism. He said it was a means of protecting Jewish life and enabling mitzvot on a national scale. I want to explain that in very practical terms. I'll tell you a line I've used with many people that I talked to Chutz La'aretz. People ask me, if I don't bring it up first, what's some of the differences of living in Israel, besides the obvious? What are some of the differences of living in Israel versus living in Chutz La'aretz? And one I like to come back to often is, let's take Pesach as an example, and say a person lives in New York City, or they live in Los Angeles or in Detroit or wherever they might be, in some big city. I'm not talking about the little towns right now, but big cities. It's Pesach. So where is it Pesach exactly in those cities? So it's Pesach in the shul, it's Pesach in the houses, it's Pesach in the local Jewish kosher stores, and the butcher and the baker or bakery. But it's not Pesach in the street. You don't get this feeling like you're being surrounded by Pesach. It's not out there in the street. Lahavdil elf alfei avdalos, when a person is in the United States after Thanksgiving until January 1st, they do get the feeling, unfortunately, depending on your perspective, almost everywhere they go, they're being consumed by the holiday season. Let's leave it at that. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Lahavdil. So we move to here. I'm saying now we come to Israel. And where's it Pesach here? Let's say it's Pesach in the house, on the buses, in the streets, in the stores, in the shuls, everywhere. Doesn't mean people are all keeping Pesach and everyone's eating a shear of matzah like the Chazon Ish. I'm not saying that. I'm just talking about the presence of the holiday of the Chag in a person's life. It's you can't even escape it. It's everywhere, and that's part of the difference. And this is what Rav Reines and others of his ilk were very much trying to tell us, that this will need to be the future. That it's not just a Jewish state. It's not just a state that has Jewish people. It is a state that is permeated, it should be, with enabling mitzvot on a national scale. Mizrahi institutionalized religious Zionism and saw that Torah would have a seat at the table, which, when you think about it, is pretty amazing. A pretty amazing idea. So now let's just take a little general overview or look at what Zionism was, and maybe what it wasn't, and what it is today. Zionism was not a rebellion against Judaism. It was not a monolithic ideology. We've just seen that people had different. Monolithic means just like a line, straight. It's like, okay, this is the reason we need Zionism. No, it was nothing like that. It was a combination of so many different things, including the religious aspects, including the secular, the fear, not the fear, but the need for a homeland. And it was a rejection of exile theology, because it was believed, at least within the Mizrahi world and other religious Zionists, that the religion in Chutz La'aretz could not survive to the same level as it can in Israel. And by the way, that's nothing new. You think, oh, wow, they really came up with a brilliant idea. Not at all. It's in the Gemara. The Gemara has it in multiple places. There's an expression the Gemara uses in many places, which is avira da'ara machkim, that it's just the air, just the environment of being in Israel makes one wiser. And I told you before in other classes that I know that doesn't make me wiser, but it definitely has changed my perspective in life and brought a new perspective on so many things since we've made Aliyah. Bezrat Hashem, this summer will be 17 years, hard to believe. So avira da'ara machkim. There's a halacha. The Gemara mentions that the Rambam might almost sure brings the halacha, but I don't want to say he did. That Gemara says it's better to live in Israel with idolaters than to live in Chutz La'aretz with people who are Shomrei Torah mitzvot. It's a pretty strong statement, very strong statement. Zionism is a survival strategy, at least back then, even more so now, it seems. A response to historical rupture and a Jewish argument about how Jews remain Jews in a modern world. Remember, any time you live is the most modern time in history. But to the best that could be done then, and today especially, that we have the much more freedom that they did in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Israel, because it wasn't under our jurisdiction yet. Jews can remain Jews. One of the most amazing things about Israel is that you can find almost a community for almost anywhere a person is on the spectrum of religiosity, whether it's the absolutely no religion whatsoever, and B'ezrat Hashem yet, but they will have, to the most right wing, whatever they do in Torah, and everything in between. You can find a community, you can find a home. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean it's going to be cheap. Doesn't mean it's going to be anything. Just that there are people who run the gamut in the country. In most communities in Chutz La'aretz, you tend to find two or three, I'm talking within the Orthodox world, two or three types of boxes that a person fits in. You don't have 25 different boxes. Here you probably have 100 different boxes. The internal debates when it came to the different movements within the Zionist world, whether it was at the World Zionist Congress or among the different movements themselves, their leadership, was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of life. I actually had this discussion with somebody the other day that conflict, debate, differences of opinion, it's all good. It's like I've had it a number of times when I'll be teaching something. Usually it's in person, not so much when it's on the computer. And someone will challenge me on something. And I've seen it where almost always if someone challenges me, somebody else says, oh, no, it's not okay. So no, exactly the opposite. I mean, you go into a Beit Midrash, go into a shul when the Rav is speaking, when it's interactive. And let's just say I've seen Rav Sabato. He's giving a class, a shir, or he's talking about something, and someone will call out something and challenge or question, and it's good. That's what keeps you. Open a Gemara. That's all it is from the beginning of Brachot to the end of Nida. It's all machloket, and that's how we come to conclusions. That's how the truth comes out eventually. Except in Yerushalmi. Except in Yerushalmi, and I've spoken about Yerushalmi, which I've been learning for a number of years now. That there's machloket, there's dispute, and if it's not germane to the subject, they don't even pay attention. They just move on. They don't even respond to the person, which took me a while to get used to, but I really like it. I have become after all these years, I become a yes to Yerushalmi person, Bezrat Hashem, for the rest of my life. Bezrat Hashem. Anyways, so again, the debates were not a sign of weakness, but it was vitality, it was life. Religious Zionism didn't join Zionism late. It was always there. It was always maybe in the background, but it wasn't necessarily in an official capacity. It was arguing, it was shaping, it was restraining, it was sanctifying, but it was always contributing to the discussion of Zionism. So for those of us who affiliate with the world of religious Zionism, we have much to be proud of. We have mistakes and we have problems like every other movement and like every other group of people on earth. But there's a lot to be very proud of as well. Okay, he takes a long drink. Don't worry, it's water. And if it's not, you'll never know. I think it's important. We talked about, when we were talking about the mid and late 1800s, we talked about the reform movement. We've talked about it because of the opposition from certain people, especially from Rav Hirsch Zatzal, Shimshon Farel Hirsch, and others, that what drove them was making sure that it was very clear that what is important is fealty to halacha and not changing halacha, in some cases literally throwing it out the window. There's another movement, which we are aware of, which is much smaller, especially today. The conservative movement is dwindling. What's happening in the conservative movement in general, and I'm going to, next time, Bezrat Hashem, because we won't finish tonight, but when we first finish talking about conservative Judaism and the history and all, I'll show you a chart that's mind-blowing when it comes to the projected growth rates of Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism, and the projected rates of, I don't know, word members or whatever, people who associate with those different movements over the course of the next 50 years or 25 years, done by Pew Research, PEW. It was written up in many, many places I think it's about 2-3 years ago, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. I think it's important though for us to see it, to understand it. But we'll get to that eventually. But I do want to talk about conservative Judaism, because most people who have had zero connection to conservative or Reform Judaism have a very big misunderstanding of what it is. Let's start back for a second with Reform Judaism, which was to reform Judaism, not reformed. It's called Reform Judaism. And we talked length about it already. Again, got rid of a lot of halacha, threw certain things out, allowed to have mixed marriages and between Jew and non-Jew, a whole litany of things. And many people looked at conservative Judaism with the same perspective. That's all it is, just threw out all the Torah and all. And the truth is, it's not accurate. In addition to that, not only is conservative Judaism originally not trying to pull away from Orthodox Judaism, and part of it was actually trying to help the Orthodox world. So let's talk about what this is. And I'll give you, I think, a different perspective on conservative. I'm not advocating for conservative Judaism. I'm not advocating for Reform Judaism. But I think as part of a Jewish history class, it's important to understand the different approaches people have had over time, and then we will move back into the Orthodox world. So let's start from the beginning. It did not arise or start as a rebellion against Torah. Not even a breakaway from orthodoxy. It came as a defense mechanism or reaction, in a sense, to attempt to preserve halachic Judaism, which were going through some upheavals because of modernity, that were starting to take apart traditional life in Europe and in America. Conservative Judaism began, for lack of a better term, as a piece of or a movement of crisis management, a serious effort to prevent total collapse. That was its perspective. But over time, it reshaped its relationship to halacha, which became a big problem. In other words, something that started off with very good intentions. They say that good intentions, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's what ended up happening here. That what was meant to be a form of crisis management to prevent any more deterioration within the Orthodox world eventually takes on a life of its own, and it starts to break in many cases with what's considered normative halacha. So that's just like the introductory sentence. Where did it come from? How did it happen? So we'll go back to the 19th century. By the early 19th century, again, European Jewry was going through three major shocks. One is political emancipation, meaning that whereas the churches in the past, let's say they go back to the 13th century, the 14th century, the 15th century, the church was the power, and the kings were considered divinely ordained through the church. The idea of the emancipation, the idea of the Enlightenment changed a lot of things. That was one thing that was happening, and that was affecting the Jews as well, which we've seen. We're not going through that again. There was also what was known as the Wissenschaft des Judentums, which was in English the the academic historical study of Judaism. What does that mean? It was the premise of I wanted to give it. I've learned about it and I've taught about it, but I had to get a good working definition. It was premised, I'm going to read it to you, premised on the critical investigation of Jewish literature and culture, including rabbinic literature, to analyze the origin of Jewish traditions. It meant, in a sense, it was starting to poke holes in tradition. And the final major effect or crisis or bombshell was the rise of Reform Judaism. Traditional rabbinic authority was being challenged from two directions. On one hand, they're being challenged from below, meaning Jews were abandoning observance. On the other hand, they were being challenged from above because the intellectual elites were starting to question the historical foundations of halakha, which meant, you're telling me my whole life that the Torah was given to us by God. Good, okay, very nice. How do you know that? What's your basis for that? Just because your father told you that, and his father, so what? You know, we're intelligent people. We're part of this enlightenment. Enlighten me. Where did it come from? Prove it. Show me your cards. So Reform Judaism had a very simple solution. It was easy. Let's discard halachic binding altogether. Whatever halacha tells me to do, I don't have to do it anymore. Or I'm going to reshape it. I'm going to reframe it. I'm going to make it fit me. Conservative Judaism emerged at the beginning as a rejection of that solution, meaning here you have orthodoxy. It's starting to be chipped away at. And along comes Reform Judaism as basically saying, let's take the Shulchan Aruch and just throw it away for the most part. Along comes other people who become known then as conservative Judaism or conservative Jews who say, no, we're going to reject the solution of the Reform movement because that's not a good solution. We still need to stay somewhat close to the halakha. We are going to have our differences and everything else, but we have to try to stay true to halakha. The intellectual father of the conservative movement is Rabbi Zacharias Frankel. Rabbi Frankel was born beginning of 1801, and lived to 1875. So again, this is the exact same time period of we talked about, which was the Haskalah, the Maskilim, the Jewish Enlightenment. It's the time period of the it's branching into the Zionist movement time. It's branching into the time period of the Reform movement. It's branching into all of these things we've been talking about for the last 3 or 4 months. And this is the time period in which conservative Judaism is coming into its own. Frankel rejected Reform theology very sharply. He insisted halakha is binding. Now, that statement, to believe that the beginning of the conservative movement began with a statement, halakha is binding, and you compare it to where the conservative movement is holding today, is very stark contrast. Again, the movement itself has gotten very small because I started to mention in the beginning, I realized I got sidetracked, is that within the conservative movement, either people were becoming more religious or less religious, either becoming Orthodox or becoming Reform. And in the meantime, what's happening is that the conservative movement has been getting narrower and narrower. He also rejected the claim that Judaism is just ethical monotheism. There were those who believed, and especially within the Reform movement, that what is Judaism? All it really was the monotheistic religion with ethics. And it didn't necessarily have to have a fealty to God, didn't have to have fealty to Torah, didn't have to, because after all, Reform movement said human beings wrote the Torah in over centuries. It wasn't just one author. And Frankl also rejected any major liturgical changes. When we're learning about the Reform movement, we talked about how they were making major changes in the prayers and in other liturgy of the Jewish people. But Frankl also rejected Orthodoxy as it was promulgated in what was known at that time as Neo-Orthodoxy, founded by Rav Hirsch. He wasn't on the same page with Rav Hirsch. His core beliefs, meaning Frankl's core ideas about Judaism, is that Judaism is positive, meaning it's binding, and it's historical, developed over time. He believed that halakha evolves, which he's right. Halakha evolves, and I'll explain why he's right in a minute. Change has to emerge from within the tradition, and the Jewish people are the carriers of halakha. In classical, this is the key phrase here. I'm going to read you something I wrote down. In classical Judaism, halakha defines the people. In Frankl's thought, the people increasingly define the halakha. What does that mean? There is a phrase that I'm sure you've heard, that the Torah doesn't change with the times change with the Torah. I've had people who say to me, I've had discussions, especially those who are questioning, I understand. There were no computers, there's no electricity when God gave the Torah. I believe he gave us the Torah, I believe in God, but there are no computers, so how are you telling me that I can't use my computer, I can't be on my phone at Shabbat? Those kind of questions. And so, of course, halakha has to address the issues. It wasn't saying that, well, when Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity, if he indeed did, that now that wasn't in the Torah, so it's okay. It doesn't. We're not even going to try to see how that fits into normative Judaism. It's okay. You go ahead, use fire. You can use electricity on Shabbat. No, we have to. Everything has to be from the perspective of Torah. How does this new invention, whether it's electricity, computers, motion sensors, anything you can think of that's in modern times, how does halakha address that? Frankl's opinion was, we have these new things. So these things we're going to have to rewrite halakha to make sure we're able to use them or whatever we decide. And that was obviously not a very good starting point. What we're going to do, Bezrat Hashem, next week, and for those of you who came in late, I'm saying that next week again, we're going to meet on Wednesday night, because Tuesday night, Bezrat Hashem, I have a wedding. We're going to talk about the birth that he gives birth. Frankl gives birth to the Breslau Seminary, becomes known, of course, as the Jewish Theological Seminary, the JTS, which still exists today, and the difference between when it was first created and what it is today. I can't say it's night and day, but it's night and dusk. Let's say like that. It's definitely different worlds. After we finish going through the time period or the history, I'll probably do one more class. It'll take us at least on the conservative movement. And we have some other fun things to talk about after that. Bezrat Hashem. Today is Wednesday. Okay, so I can always say it's a little early in the week. Let's say Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Hope you all have a good week. Let's hope for
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi.
Bezrat Hashem. Thank you. A quiet week. And thank you all for being here tonight. I have one comment. Let me just see. Santayana. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Santayana is the one who said, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. It's actually quoted by a few people, but he is the original person who said that. That's correct. Shkoyach, as they say. All right. Have a great day, everybody, and evening.
Good night.
All right. You too.